Oh man, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Just when I thought the WNBA sabotage versus Caitlin Clark couldn't get even worse, you mean to tell me there's a chance Becky Hammond may be in on it too? Becky Hammond may be in on it too. Are you kidding me? People are going crazy about this post-game interaction between head coach of the Las Vegas Aces, Becky Hammond, and Indiana Fever head coach Stephanie White. It's already fishy. Asia Wilson was good to go. She was ready to play. Becky Hammond wouldn't let her play. Kennedy Carter looked like she just didn't want to play at all. I don't know what's going on. Can somebody explain what's going on?
Something is seriously wrong in the WNBA, and it goes deeper than anyone initially thought. We already knew Caitlin Clark was being targeted on the court. We already knew the league's response was embarrassingly weak. But now there's a new name being thrown into the conversation, and it's one that nobody saw coming. Becky Hammond, head coach of the Las Vegas Aces, one of the most respected names in women's basketball. Fans are watching a post-game interaction between Hammond and Indiana Fever head coach Stephanie White, and what they're seeing is making their jaws drop. The smiling, the whispering, the body language, all of it coming right after a blowout loss at home. Something doesn't add up, and people are starting to connect dots that the league desperately does not want connected.
This interaction between Stephanie White and Becky Hammond is making waves. It's very, very interesting, and people are calling it out. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to play this interaction, and we're going to get into it. Okay. You are going to see, boom, you see Stephanie White and Becky Hammond. Well, first of all, Becky Hammond, you lost. You got this huge, you got this huge smile on your face. You're cheesing and grinning. Look at this. Like y'all just got smacked at home by like damn near 20. Like, what are you happy about? Yeah, like this interaction right here is giving fishy. Okay, we'll let it play on. Okay, you see the interaction. They're talking. Bonehead White with an actual champion in Becky Hammond. Now you see the handover. What is the secret? What are you whispering about? The people think that something is fishy. Becky Hammond, are you in on the Caitlin Clark sabotage? I don't know. This is a little odd. I'm just saying. Okay, look, Becky Hammond still cheesing and smiling. Wait a minute, man. Wait a minute. Look at this. She still, y'all just got smacked at home, and you are happy. Wait a second.
Here's where it all begins. The Las Vegas Aces just got handled at home. We're talking a near 20-point loss on their own floor. The kind of game that should leave a coaching staff embarrassed, frustrated, and ready to go back to the drawing board. That's the normal reaction. That's what you'd expect from any competitive coach who takes their job seriously. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Instead, what fans watching the post-game footage saw was Becky Hammond, head coach of the Las Vegas Aces, walking over to Indiana Fever head coach Stephanie White with a massive smile on her face. Not a polite, professional smile, not the kind of tight-lipped nod you give someone after a tough game. We're talking a full, ear-to-ear, genuinely happy expression that made absolutely no sense given what had just happened on the court.
And then look at this here. Becky Hammond smiling and chuckling with White at the end of the game. I smell something fishy here. Hey. I ain't the only one that smell that stench. I'm not the only one that smells that stench. Look at IDX Texas. We all know what it is. This isn't a coincidence. That embrace was saying thank you for helping our agenda. Look at this, because the game is rigged. Don't you see the Fever play better without CC? Watch CC be out the rest of the season. Stephanie White continues to win, so CC is the problem. See? Not to mention covering her face when she's talking. Yeah. Fishy indeed. See what I'm saying? So people are catching on.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
Her team had just been dominated, embarrassed even, and she looked like she just won a championship. Now, take a step back for a second, because context matters here. These are two head coaches in a competitive professional league. One of them just lost badly, the other just won. That dynamic is usually pretty clear in how coaches carry themselves after a game. The winning coach might be relieved, satisfied, maybe even a little fired up. The losing coach is typically measured, professional, already mentally moving on to what needs to be fixed. But in this interaction, the energy was completely reversed. Stephanie White, whose team had just put on a clinic, seemed almost understated in comparison to the sheer enthusiasm radiating off of Becky Hammond. And then came the moment that really set social media on fire. As the two coaches spoke, there was a clear and deliberate hand gesture, a lean in, a moment where the conversation became notably more private.
Now let's get into this part. Let's get into this. It was always, I've always said, and will always maintain it. Stephanie White is trying to give A'ja Wilson an MVP, blah, blah, blah. So people have all of these reasons, right? And people are calling this stuff out. People are calling these things out. Stephanie White is in cahoots with Becky Hammond, all of this stuff. Now,
lips covered, words exchanged that nobody nearby could hear. For fans who were already suspicious about the way things were unfolding around Caitlin Clark, this was like pouring gasoline on a fire that was already burning. The comment sections exploded. People were dissecting every frame of that interaction, analyzing body language, questioning motives, and asking the same question over and over again. What exactly was said, and why did it need to be said so privately? To be absolutely clear, there is no confirmed evidence of any wrongdoing here. What we're talking about is a moment that sparked widespread speculation among fans who have been watching the Caitlin Clark situation unfold with growing frustration. But speculation or not, the reaction from the fan base was immediate, intense, and impossible to ignore. When thousands of people who follow this league closely are all pointing at the same moment and saying something feels off, that's worth paying attention to. That's worth digging into. And the deeper you dig, the more layers you find.
Let's get into some of that. I mean, this stuff is insane. Let's check it out.
And that's where I don't understand the players that felt like, well, we need to make sure Caitlin Clark knows that she's still a rookie, or at this point now a third-year player, but she got to earn her stripes. Everybody's paycheck is bigger because of her. And that's I don't understand. But the WNBA, they've gone too fast. They went too fast in getting to where they're at, and I don't feel like they've been able to keep up with some of the other, like you said, how they're handling Caitlin Clark, how they're handling even the expansion, how they're handling these types of situations. And it could be done pretty simply by coming out and having Caitlin Clark's back. Now it's going to tick off the rest of the league, but to understand, we're shutting this down. And that's where I don't...
I'm with him. I'm with him on this. I think he made some excellent points. But overall, the hostility stems from the jealousy, and the jealousy has overtaken any logic it's all emotion, no logic. And it's too much envy and hate that won't allow them to see the...
What made the interaction even more jarring was what came immediately after. Hammond, still visibly in good spirits, was seen chuckling and sharing what appeared to be a genuinely warm exchange with White near the end of the postgame scene. Not a brief, courteous goodbye, and an extended, friendly, almost celebratory moment between two coaches where one of them had absolutely nothing to celebrate, at least not on paper. And that right there is where the questions really start to multiply. Because if you just got blown out at home, what exactly are you laughing about? Fans online were not subtle in their interpretations. Comments ranged from pointed observations about the suspicious timing of the interaction to outright theories about coaches working together toward a common agenda. Some pointed to the fact that covering your mouth while talking to someone in a public recorded setting is a deliberate choice.
About this on the Big Play Cleveland as well. Bruce Drennan spoke about this. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about it.
Big deal. Now Thomas is trying to reverse it and say that death threats have been made against me and my family, and this isn't the first time racial slurs. The WNBA commissioner is a joke. It's a woman by the name of Kathy Engelbert. She may go down as the worst commissioner of any sport in the history of any of our lifetimes combined.
Yeah, he's cooking right now. He's cooking.
Caitlin Clark has been targeted ever since she came into the WNBA. They have practically molested her physically.
Damn.
And non-calls made. And I think, talk about racism. And I can't help but think, what is the mentality of these opposing players doing this to her when they should be kissing her tail for putting that sport on the map when nobody cared about it?
That's a fact. He's cooking.
The only reason for putting that sport on the map when nobody cared about it. The only reason WNBA is in existence is because the NBA is funding it. And she's put it on the map. She's putting fans in the seats, and they're targeting her to this day.
Bro, he was cooking. He was cooking. Bruce Drennan, you was cooking with that one. Boy, you was cooking with that one.
You do that when you don't want anyone to know what you're saying. Whether that was done out of professional habit or something else entirely is impossible to say for certain, but it added another layer to an already uncomfortable moment that people simply could not stop watching. The clip spread fast. Basketball fans, sports commentators, and casual observers all weighed in. And while opinions varied on what exactly the interaction meant, there was one thing almost everyone agreed on: it looked strange. It felt out of place. And in the context of everything else that had been happening around Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever, strange and out of place were two things nobody could afford to dismiss anymore. Because this wasn't the first red flag, not by a long shot.
This is the interesting thing, because obviously A'ja Wilson didn't play. And I feel like if A'ja Wilson plays, the Las Vegas Aces win the game. But A'ja Wilson was ready to play. She wanted to play. Becky Hammond wouldn't let her?
I don't know. We'll see. Look, injuries. She came back. She finished that game in Chicago. Sometimes you come back and, she's historically been a very quick healer. She's still young. So, we don't want to rush back. I think if this was a playoff game, she'd probably be playing. But,
oh, you heard that, though. She wanted to come back.
Sometimes you come back and, she's historically been a very quick healer. She's still young. So, we don't want to rush back. I think if this was a playoff game, she'd probably be playing. But she wants to play. I'm not letting her play.
She wants to play. I'm not letting her play. So A'ja Wilson was ready to go. This is also feeding into that stench and fishiness that people feel they are smelling. Okay, Becky Hammond shares the latest on A'ja Wilson's status. We don't want to rush back. I think if it was a playoff game, she'd probably be playing. She wants to play. I'm not letting her play. Okay, so clearly A'ja Wilson was good to go. Becky Hammond didn't allow it. And for her to be so happy after looking that bad, it's raising a lot of eyebrows. It's raising a lot of eyebrows. And then you got all this talk. You got people trying to down the legend of Caitlin Clark.
If the post-game interaction between Hammond and White was the spark, then the A'ja Wilson situation is the fuel that turned it into a full-blown controversy. Because here's the thing, the Las Vegas Aces didn't just lose that game without their star player, they lost it while their star player was reportedly ready and willing to suit up. Let that sink in for a moment. A'ja Wilson is not a role player. She is not someone you can comfortably leave on the bench when the game is on the line without a very, very good reason. She is the kind of talent that changes the entire dynamic of a game the moment she steps on the floor. She is dominant, experienced, and by almost every measure, one of the best players in the WNBA. So when reports started circulating that Wilson was healthy enough to play and was actively pushing to get back on the court, the fact that she was held out by Becky Hammond sent shockwaves through the fan base. And this isn't speculation or rumor, Becky Hammond confirmed it herself in the post-game press conference.
Guess what? WNBA Rico still out there. They are back on the news. The big weekend show on Fox News spoke about it. We got to get into that too. Becky Hammond, you might be in on the sabotage, bro. I don't know.
Kevin, help me out here.
Wait, what?
She punches the girl in the throat, and then she says that it's just amazing that she's remained silent, and she's fearing for her life. And apparently, Caitlin Clark was supposed to go on social media and defend herself being punched in the throat.
It's just so crazy. And here's the thing, like we talked about before, if you want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, keep this up. Everybody wants to love this sport. Everybody wants to love this player.
Yeah.
Take the ride, baby. Take the W. Instead, they are wrecking their own sport by not only not calling fouls when they should, they're making it even worse because they're making casual fans like me. I'm not a fan, but you know, if Caitlin Clark's going to be on, might I leave the remote on for a couple of minutes? Sure, but not as long as I think they're mistreating their own player, which they are. It's ridiculous.
Man, look, y'all getting blasted on the news still. Kathy Engelbert, I don't know what the hell you gonna do. I don't know what the hell you gonna do. This whole Becky Hammond situation looks bad. Fans are calling it catfish, tilapia, salmon. Smells fishy. I'm just saying.
The exact words she used were simple, direct, and immediately controversial. She wanted to play. I'm not letting her play. 5 words that launched 1,000 questions. Because when your best player wants to compete and is physically capable of doing so, the decision to keep her sidelined is not a minor coaching call, it's a statement. And people wanted to know what exactly that statement was trying to say. Hammond's reasoning on the surface was straightforward enough. She referenced Wilson's injury history, her age, and the idea that they didn't want to rush her back into action. She even acknowledged that if it had been a playoff game, Wilson would almost certainly have been on the court. And look, on its own, that reasoning isn't completely unreasonable. Teams do manage player health throughout the regular season. Coaches do make calculated decisions about when to push and when to hold back. That part of the conversation is normal. But here's where it stops being normal. Wilson had already shown that she was capable of pushing through. She had come back and finished a previous game in Chicago, which by itself suggests a level of toughness and physical readiness that most players would envy. The fact that she was chomping at the bit to get back into the lineup for this particular game and was actively told no by her own head coach raised eyebrows in a way that the standard injury management narrative couldn't fully explain away. And then you add the post-game smile, the laughter, the whispered conversation with the opposing coach after a blowout loss. Suddenly, the decision to hold Wilson out doesn't exist in isolation anymore. It exists alongside a pattern of behavior that fans are struggling to rationalize. Because if you genuinely wanted to win that game, you play your best player when she's ready to go. If you genuinely wanted to win that game, you don't walk off the court grinning from ear to ear after getting dominated. Something about the whole picture doesn't line up, and the fan base noticed immediately. Online reaction to the Wilson situation was swift and heated. People pointed out that holding out a healthy star player in a game you're clearly losing made zero competitive sense. Others argued that the decision, paired with Hammond's inexplicably cheerful post-game demeanor, suggested that winning wasn't actually the priority. Theories multiplied quickly, ranging from the reasonable to the wild, but all of them circling back to the same central concern: was the outcome of this game important to Becky Hammond, or was something else going on? Again, to be fair, none of the theories circulating online have been confirmed by any direct evidence. What we have is a coach's decision that struck many as puzzling, her own words confirming that her star player was ready and willing to play, and a post-game atmosphere that felt completely disconnected from the reality of a significant home loss. Whether those things add up to something intentional or are simply the result of poor optics and a coaching philosophy that prioritizes long-term health over short-term results is genuinely difficult to say. But the conversation it sparked was impossible to contain, and it was about to get a whole lot bigger. Because the Wilson situation didn't exist in a bubble. It existed in the middle of a much larger, much more explosive debate about what was really happening to Caitlin Clark in the WNBA, and once people started connecting those dots, the entire conversation shifted to a completely different level. To understand why the Becky Hammond post-game moment landed with such force, you have to understand what was already happening in the background. The conversation around Caitlin Clark and the WNBA had been building for months, layer by layer, incident by incident, until it reached a boiling point that was impossible to ignore. And at the center of all of it was a question that kept coming up no matter how many times people tried to shut it down: is Caitlin Clark being deliberately undermined? Clark arrived in the WNBA as arguably the most anticipated rookie in the league's history. The numbers she had put up in college were historic. The attention she had brought to women's basketball was unprecedented. Arenas that had been half empty for years were suddenly selling out. Television ratings that had been modest for decades were spiking in ways the league had never seen before. By almost every measurable standard, Caitlin Clark was not just good for the Indiana Fever, she was transformative for the entire WNBA. And yet, from almost the moment she stepped onto a professional court, something felt wrong. The physicality directed at her went beyond what most observers considered normal for a professional basketball game. Hard fouls that drew no whistle, contact that in any other context would have been called immediately, was allowed to continue. And the silence from the league office in response to concerns raised by fans, analysts, and eventually mainstream media was deafening. The WNBA, which had every reason in the world to protect and celebrate the player who was single-handedly expanding its audience, seemed almost determined to look the other way. The player reaction was even more complicated. Rather than embracing the wave of attention Clark had brought to the sport, a notable portion of the league's established players seemed resentful of it. The narrative that Clark needed to earn her stripes despite being a demonstrable economic engine for every single person in the league was one that kept surfacing in interviews and social media posts. Players who were cashing larger checks precisely because of Clark's impact were simultaneously dismissing her value and questioning her legitimacy. It was a contradiction so glaring that even casual observers started to call it out. The argument being made by fans and commentators who were following the situation closely was straightforward and difficult to counter. Every player in the WNBA was making more money because Caitlin Clark existed. Sponsorships were up, attendance was up, media deals were improving. The entire economic landscape of the league had shifted because of the audience she brought with her from college basketball. For veteran players to respond to that reality with hostility instead of gratitude was not just bad optics. It was, according to many observers, a form of collective self-destruction that made no logical sense. But logic, as multiple commentators pointed out, had very little to do with what was driving the reaction. Emotion was driving it, specifically jealousy. The kind of deep, consuming jealousy that doesn't respond to reason or self-interest because it's operating on a purely instinctive level. Players who had dedicated years of their careers to a league that barely anyone outside of hardcore basketball circles paid attention to were suddenly watching a rookie walk in and become the face of everything overnight. Whether or not that reaction was understandable on a human level, the consequences of acting on it were potentially catastrophic for the sport as a whole. And the consequences were already starting to show. Fans who had tuned in specifically because of Caitlin Clark were watching her get targeted, watching the league do nothing, and making decisions about whether they wanted to continue watching. The casual viewer that the WNBA desperately needed to convert into a long-term fan was seeing a product that felt unfair, poorly managed, and openly hostile to the player they had come to see. The window of opportunity that Clark's arrival had opened was starting to close, and the people in a position to stop it were either making it worse or staying silent. The Becky Hammond moment dropped into the middle of this already tense situation like a match into a room full of fumes. Because for fans who were already convinced that something was deeply wrong with the way the WNBA was operating around Caitlin Clark, seeing a coach smile and whisper after a blowout loss, and then confirm that she'd held out her best player despite her being ready to compete, was not an isolated incident. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle. And the picture that puzzle was forming was one that made a lot of people genuinely angry. Theories about Stephanie White and her motivations had been circulating for a while before the Hammond interaction brought them back into sharp focus. Some fans had been arguing for weeks that decisions being made around the Fever's roster and playing time didn't always seem oriented toward winning. Others pointed to specific game situations where the handling of Clark seemed questionable at best. None of it had been proven, and all of it remained firmly in the territory of fan speculation. But the volume of that speculation and the consistency of the concerns being raised was reaching a level that was hard to dismiss as fringe thinking. What was particularly striking about this moment was how it seemed to pull together threads from multiple different directions. The physical targeting on the court, the league's non-response, the player resentment, the coaching decisions that raised eyebrows, all of it was suddenly converging around this one post-game interaction, and the result was a conversation that was no longer contained to basketball forums and social media comment sections. It was going mainstream fast. When a sports controversy makes the jump from fan discussion to national news coverage, something significant has happened. It means the story has grown beyond the boundaries of its original audience and started resonating with people who don't normally pay close attention to the sport in question. And that is exactly what happened with the Caitlin Clark situation. It didn't stay inside the WNBA bubble. It exploded outward, and the fallout landed in places that the league almost certainly did not want it to land. Fox News picked up the story. That alone tells you something about the scale of what was happening. Sports controversies occasionally make the news, but they typically stay in the sports media ecosystem. When a story about a women's basketball player and the treatment she's receiving from her own league starts getting serious airtime on a major national news network, that's a signal that the conversation has taken on a cultural dimension that goes far beyond the sport itself, and the commentary that came with the coverage was not gentle. The discussion on air was pointed and specific. Commentators argued that what was happening to Caitlin Clark on the court, the uncalled fouls, the aggressive physical targeting, the league's apparent indifference to all of it, represented something deeply troubling about the state of the WNBA as an institution. One commentator went as far as calling out WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert by name, suggesting that her handling of the Clark situation could make her one of the worst commissioners in the history of professional sports. That's a brutal assessment, but it was one that resonated with a lot of people who had been watching events unfold and growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of meaningful response from league leadership. The specific argument being made was one that fans had been raising for months, but hearing it stated plainly on national television gave it a different kind of weight. Clark had been targeted from the moment she arrived. The physical contact directed at her was described in terms that went well beyond normal basketball roughness. And through all of it, the league that should have been her most vocal advocate had essentially stayed quiet, issued occasional vague statements about player safety, and done nothing concrete to address what was clearly becoming a PR catastrophe. The economic argument was also front and center in the media coverage. The point was made repeatedly and with genuine force. Caitlin Clark had put the WNBA on the map in a way that nobody and nothing had managed to do before her arrival. Arenas were full. Broadcasts were being watched by audiences that had never cared about women's basketball before. The entire financial trajectory of the league had changed because of one player's presence, and the response from within the sport, from players, from some corners of the coaching staff, and from the league's own leadership had been to either ignore the problem or, in the eyes of many observers, quietly enable it. The phrase that kept coming up in media coverage was visceral and memorable, killing the goose that laid the golden egg. It captured exactly what critics felt was happening. The WNBA had stumbled into a once-in-a-generation opportunity, A player had arrived who could genuinely change the long-term trajectory of the league, bring in new fans, attract major sponsorships, and build something lasting. And instead of protecting and nurturing that opportunity, the league appeared to be allowing it to be undermined from within. Whether through negligence or something more deliberate, the result was the same. Fans were getting angry, and they were talking about it everywhere. The media coverage also brought renewed attention to specific incidents that had previously been discussed mainly within basketball circles. Moments where Clark had taken hits that went uncalled. Situations where the officiating seemed inconsistent in ways that always seemed to work against her. Individual interactions between Clark and opposing players that had sparked controversy at the time and were now being revisited in the context of a much larger narrative. Each one of these incidents, viewed individually, might have been explainable. Viewed together through the lens of a national media conversation that was actively looking for patterns, they started to look like something harder to wave away. And then there was the commissioner situation. Kathy Engelbert had already been the subject of significant criticism from fans and commentators who felt her leadership had been inadequate in the face of a growing crisis. The mainstream media coverage intensified that scrutiny considerably. Questions were being asked about why the league hadn't taken a more definitive public stance in support of its most marketable player. Why the response to complaints about officiating had been so muted. Why a league that had everything to gain from Caitlin Clark's success seemed so reluctant to do the basic work of protecting that success. None of these questions were answered in any satisfying way during this period. And that silence, much like Hammond's smile after a blowout loss, spoke volumes to the people watching closely. Because when you're the commissioner of a league that is generating more attention than it ever has before, and the source of that attention is being targeted in ways that are making national news, staying quiet is not a neutral position. It's a choice. And it's a choice that a growing number of people were starting to view very unfavorably. The mainstream media explosion also had a practical effect on the conversation's reach. People who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives were suddenly aware of what was happening to Caitlin Clark. Casual sports fans who might have tuned in out of curiosity were instead encountering a narrative about unfair treatment and institutional failure before they'd even had a chance to form their own opinions about the product. The league's image problem wasn't just a basketball problem anymore, it was a culture problem, and those are significantly harder to fix. Of all the elements feeding into the Caitlin Clark controversy, the most visceral and most visible has been what has happened to her physically on the court. This isn't a matter of interpretation or reading between the lines of post-game interactions. This is documented, on-camera, repeated contact that has been witnessed by millions of viewers and debated extensively by everyone from die-hard basketball analysts to people who have never watched a WNBA game before in their lives. And the debate, ultimately, keeps coming back to the same uncomfortable question: why has the league allowed this to continue? To understand the full picture, you have to start with what Clark walked into when she entered the league. She wasn't just a highly anticipated rookie, she was a phenomenon. A player whose college career had generated the kind of sustained national attention that most professional leagues would spend decades and millions of dollars trying to manufacture organically. She walked through the door already famous, already celebrated, already beloved by a massive audience that had followed her from college basketball into the professional game. For some of her new colleagues, that was exciting. For others, it was apparently threatening. The physical nature of the game is something Clark would have expected going in. Professional basketball is more physical than the college game. That's standard. Players are bigger, stronger, more experienced, and the contact that officials allow is generally more significant at the professional level. Clark, by all accounts, understood that and was prepared for it. But what she encountered in the WNBA went beyond the normal adjustment period for a professional rookie. It went beyond the expected step up in physicality. What she encountered, according to observers who have watched the footage carefully, was something that looked much more like deliberate targeting. Incidents began accumulating almost immediately. Hard fouls that had no apparent basketball purpose, contact delivered in moments where the ball was nowhere near Clark, and the only logical explanation for the physicality was to send a message. Situations where Clark was hit in ways that in any other professional sporting context would have resulted in immediate whistles and significant consequences, and instead, again and again, the officials let it go, the league stayed quiet, and Clark, to her enormous credit, kept playing. The discussion about what was driving the targeting quickly became racially charged in ways that made the conversation significantly more complex. Some commentators argued that the reluctance of certain players to embrace Clark and the physical aggression directed at her had a racial dimension that deserved to be acknowledged and examined. Others pushed back strongly on that framing, arguing that the situation was more about professional jealousy and economic resentment than about race. The debate was heated, unresolved, and added another layer of tension to an already explosive situation. What made the racial dimension of the conversation particularly complicated was that it cut in multiple directions simultaneously. On one side, there were people arguing that Clark, as a white player who had become the face of a league that had historically been dominated by black athletes, was encountering hostility rooted in racial dynamics. On the other side, there were people arguing that framing the situation in racial terms was itself a form of deflection from the real issues of professional jealousy and institutional failure. Neither side was willing to fully concede the other's point, and the result was a debate that generated enormous heat but very little clarity. What was clearer and less contested was the reality of what was happening on the court and the league's failure to address it. Regardless of what was motivating the targeting, the fact that it was happening and going largely unchecked was something that people across the political and cultural spectrum found troubling. The specific case of Clark being physically assaulted in ways that were captured on camera, and then seeing the league's response amount to essentially nothing, was a recurring flashpoint that kept the controversy alive and growing. One particular incident that drew widespread attention involved contact so blatant that it became essentially impossible to contextualize as ordinary basketball physicality. Clark was struck in a way that commentators and fans immediately flagged as excessive, aggressive, and clearly intentional. The reaction from the officiating crew in that moment, or more precisely, the absence of any meaningful reaction, became one of the most discussed moments of the entire controversy. Clips circulated widely, media coverage intensified, and the question of why the WNBA was not protecting one of its most valuable players became unavoidable. Clark's response to all of it was itself the subject of significant commentary. She didn't go to social media to vent. She didn't hold lengthy press conferences to air grievances. She showed up, competed, took the hits, and kept moving. For many of her supporters, that restraint was admirable but also frustrating. The argument was made that by staying quiet, Clark was making it easier for the league to continue doing nothing, because the absence of a loud public complaint from the victim herself made it easier to downplay the severity of what was happening. But others countered that the restraint was strategic and dignified, and that the story was getting told loudly enough by the people watching without Clark needing to add to it. What nobody could argue was that the physical targeting was having zero impact on the broader narrative. If anything, it was having the opposite effect. Every new incident added fuel to a fire that was already burning hot. Every uncalled foul, every moment of contact that went unaddressed, every clip that went viral and was met with silence from the league office made the story bigger, louder, and more damaging to the institution that was failing to address it. And the Becky Hammond postgame moment, arriving in the middle of all of this, felt to many observers like one more piece of a pattern that was becoming impossible to explain away. At the center of every conversation about the Caitlin Clark situation, beneath the player drama and the coaching controversies and the viral moments, there is one institution that ultimately bears responsibility for all of it: the WNBA itself. And the person who sits at the top of that institution, the one who sets the tone and makes the decisions and ultimately answers for how the league handles its most important challenges, is Commissioner Kathy Engelbert. And the verdict being delivered by fans, commentators, and now mainstream media on how she has handled this moment is not a kind one. To be fair, running a professional sports league is not simple. There are competing interests to manage, relationships to maintain, contractual obligations to navigate, and political realities that exist behind the scenes that the public never sees. The commissioner of any league is constantly balancing pressures from multiple directions simultaneously, and the decisions that look obvious from the outside often have complications that aren't immediately visible. All of that is true, and it's worth acknowledging before getting into the specific criticisms that have been leveled at Engelbert's handling of the Clark situation. With that said, the criticism has been substantial, pointed, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. The core argument is straightforward. The WNBA has, in Caitlin Clark, the most transformative player it has ever seen. The evidence for that statement is everywhere. Attendance figures, television ratings, sheer volume of mainstream media attention being paid to a league that for most of its existence has struggled to break through into the broader sports conversation. Clark's arrival changed the game in the most literal possible sense, and the commissioner's job in a moment like that is to protect that asset and the opportunity it represents. Instead, by the account of a growing number of observers, Engelbert's response to the controversy surrounding Clark has been inadequate at every turn. When Clark was physically targeted in ways that drew national attention, the league's public response was measured to the point of meaninglessness. When the officiating disparities that fans were pointing to gained significant media traction, the response from league leadership was muted. When the story jumped from sports media into mainstream news coverage, the commissioner's office did not appear to respond with the urgency that the situation demanded. The question being asked most frequently is the simplest one: why? Why would a league that has everything to gain from Caitlin Clark's success fail so consistently to take actions that would protect that success? The answers people have proposed range widely. Some argue it's pure institutional incompetence, a league office that is simply not equipped to manage a story of this scale and is therefore defaulting to damage control strategies that were designed for a much smaller, quieter organization. Others suggest something more deliberate, a conscious decision to avoid alienating veteran players and establish power structures within the league even at the cost of the massive opportunity Clark represents. Neither explanation is particularly flattering. If it's incompetence, that's a damning reflection on the leadership of an organization that has a genuine once-in-a-generation chance to change its fortunes and appears to be squandering it through sheer inability to manage a crisis effectively. If it's something more calculated, then it represents a form of institutional cowardice that prioritizes internal peace over the long-term health of the league. Either way, the outcome for the WNBA is the same. A story that should have been about the most exciting player to ever join the league has instead become a story about dysfunction, unfairness, and leadership failure. The expansion question also plays into this in an interesting way. The WNBA had been growing before Clark arrived, and part of the commissioner's challenge has been managing an expansion process that was already underway while simultaneously dealing with the Clark phenomenon. Some commentators have argued that the league moved too fast in its expansion plans without building the infrastructure, both physical and institutional, to properly manage the level of attention and scrutiny that Clark's arrival brought with it. The officiating inconsistencies, the media management challenges, the inability to get ahead of narratives that were damaging the league's reputation, all of these problems, the argument goes, reflect an organization that was scaling up its ambitions faster than its actual capabilities could support. Whether or not that's the full explanation, the practical reality is that the WNBA finds itself in a position that should be the envy of every other league in women's sports, and instead is becoming a cautionary tale about institutional failure. The audience is there. The interest is there. The player who can sustain and grow both of those things is there, suiting up every night and competing despite everything being thrown at her. And the league, whose entire future could be secured by simply doing the work of protecting and supporting what it has, keeps finding new ways to make the situation worse. The commissioner has not been without defenders. Some observers have argued that the criticism directed at Engelbert has been unfair, and that the complexity of managing a league under these circumstances is being underappreciated by people who are reacting emotionally to a charged situation. Those are legitimate points worth considering. But the defense of Engelbert's record tends to struggle when it has to contend with the very specific, very visible failures that have defined this period. It's one thing to argue that the situation is complicated. It's another to explain why the complications keep resulting in outcomes that hurt the league's most valuable player and the broader audience she represents. What the commissioner needed to do, and what she consistently failed to do according to the harshest critics, was simple in principle, even if complex in execution. Come out publicly, stand behind Clark, make clear that the physical targeting was unacceptable, use the league's platform to tell the story of this extraordinary moment in women's basketball in a way that celebrated what was happening rather than allowing the narrative to be consumed by controversy. That's leadership, and in the absence of it, the vacuum was filled by exactly the kind of chaos that continues to define the Caitlin Clark conversation to this day. So here we are, everything laid out, every angle examined, and the honest answer to the central question that started all of this, is Becky Hammond in on the Caitlin Clark sabotage, is the same answer you get when you pull back the curtain on any part of this story. We don't know. What we know is what we can see, and what we can see raises questions that haven't been answered. We can see a head coach who smiled and laughed warmly with the opposing coach minutes after losing a game by nearly 20 points at home. We can see that the same head coach confirmed her best player wanted to play and was physically ready to do so, and that she chose not to allow it. We can see a whispered conversation conducted with the kind of deliberate privacy you'd use if you didn't want anyone to hear what was being said. We can see all of that. What we cannot see is intent. What we cannot know, without direct evidence that doesn't currently exist, is whether any of it was deliberate or coordinated in the way that fan theories suggest. What we can say with absolute confidence is that the optics were bad. That in an environment where trust between fans and the league is already severely damaged, moments like these don't just raise eyebrows. They become evidence in a narrative that's being built in real time by millions of people who have already decided that something is wrong. Whether Becky Hammond had any hidden motivation or simply had an off night in terms of how she came across in the post-game environment, the effect of that moment was the same. It fed a fire that the WNBA desperately needs to extinguish rather than fuel. The Asia Wilson question remains. If you're playing a competitive professional game and your best player is ready to go and actively wants to play, and you're losing badly enough to need whatever advantage you can get, the decision to keep her sidelined is one that demands a clear and convincing explanation. The injury management rationale is available, and it's the one Hammond offered, but in the context of everything else surrounding the situation, a lot of people found that rationale insufficient. And their frustration with that insufficiency is completely understandable given the broader pattern they've been watching unfold. The Caitlin Clark story is not over, not even close. She is going to keep playing. She is going to keep performing at a level that demands attention. She is going to keep being the reason millions of people tune into a league that without her would be having very different conversations about its future. And every game she plays, every incident that occurs, every decision made by coaches, officials, and league leadership is going to be watched with the kind of scrutiny that only arrives when a subject has become genuinely culturally significant. The WNBA is not going to be able to manage this story by staying quiet or issuing vague statements. The audience is too large and too engaged for that approach to work anymore. What happens next is genuinely unclear. Whether the league finds the leadership clarity to turn this moment around or continues down a path that alienates the very audience it needs, whether the physical targeting of Clark on the court gets addressed in any meaningful way, whether the coaching controversies and fan theories die down or continue to escalate, all of it remains to be seen. The variables are real and significant, and predictions are difficult in an environment this charged and this unpredictable. But here's the one thing that feels certain. This conversation is not going away. The questions people are asking about what's really happening inside the WNBA around Caitlin Clark are not going to stop being asked just because no clear answers have emerged yet. If anything, the absence of clear answers has intensified the curiosity, the suspicion, and the determination of the people asking them to keep digging. Every viral moment, every suspicious interaction, every decision that doesn't quite add up becomes another reason to keep watching, keep discussing, and keep demanding accountability from an institution that has so far been far better at generating controversy than at resolving it. Becky Hammond, Stephanie White, Kathy Engelbert, and every player in the WNBA who has been part of this story in any way, all of them are going to have to reckon eventually with the reality that the audience watching all of this has never been larger, never been more engaged, and never been less willing to simply accept the official explanation and move on. That's the world the WNBA now lives in. A world where a post-game smile and a whispered conversation can become international news. A world where holding your star player out of a game you're losing badly can spark national debate. A world where the stakes of every decision, visible or invisible, have never been higher. The only question that really matters now is whether the people inside the league understand that. And based on everything we've seen so far, the jury is very much still out.